What if I told you a mother once used her own children as instruments of control, teaching fear, obedience, and manipulation before they could even walk? In Georgia, 1847, 3 triplets were born into a nightmare so precise, so calculated, that even science can't explain it. Tonight, you'll see how fear, power, and intelligence collided, and who survived the darkness. Cut to shadowed hallway. 3 small figures move in perfect synchronicity. Fade to black. The air is thick with heat, the kind of summer that presses down on your skin and seeps into your bones. You think you're alone, walking down the overgrown path of a forgotten plantation in Georgia, but the land remembers. It remembers the whispers of women who cried at night, the screams that were swallowed by the thick moss, and the secrets no one dared to speak aloud. They call it history, but this is something else entirely. Something they erased from textbooks, buried beneath polite narratives and the polished veneer of Southern charm. But I'm here to tell you the truth. Not the one they hand you in school, not the one you nod at in documentaries, but the real story of a woman whose name still drifts in the shadows of the past, a woman who did what no one dared, even to whisper. She bred her own bloodline with the slaves she owned. Imagine a mansion perched on a hill, white paint peeling under the Georgia sun, the columns rising like the silent witnesses of centuries. Inside, a woman walks through corridors lined with portraits of her ancestors, each one staring back with eyes that seem to know things you're not meant to understand. This is her dominion. Her name is whispered among the few who remember, not for kindness, not for philanthropy, but for a dark obsession that corrupted everything it touched. And on this summer day in 1847, a secret begins to unravel that will forever challenge what you believe about morality, power, and the human capacity for manipulation. She had a son, a boy of 12 years, barely more than a child himself. Yet under her tutelage, he would be drawn into the twisted architecture of her will. This wasn't just a family affair. This was a calculated play of dominance, of controlling life itself. The plantation was a laboratory of heredity, a breeding ground for something the world wasn't ready to see. She selected her slaves with precision, choosing not for strength, not for skill, but for genetic potential. And then, over decades, she orchestrated encounters with her own blood, shaping outcomes with a cold, meticulous logic that chills the spine. The first whispers of the triplets came long before they were born. Midwives, hardened women who had delivered countless children in that region, spoke of unnatural patterns in the pregnancies, of faces in the infants that seemed to mirror both master and mother simultaneously. Children who should have been strangers in features were unmistakably bound to her own line, and no one could explain how the genetic echoes were so precise. The plantation folk began to murmur, afraid to speak openly, yet unable to ignore the impossible reality unfolding in their midst. And then there were the disappearances. Children born on the plantation, curious, bright, sometimes defiant, would vanish into the private wings of the mansion. Some were returned altered, changed, as if the invisible hand of control had been laid upon their very spirits. It was not just biology she was manipulating. She was experimenting with obedience, with submission, with the very psychology of the humans she ruled. Those who resisted were broken quietly, privately, without a single public accusation. Fear hung in the air like a living thing, subtle, pervasive, and suffocating. Think about that. The invisible architecture of terror. Not mobs, not chains alone, but psychological control crafted like a fine instrument. She understood something that few ever have. Fear is more binding than iron. Knowledge is more dangerous than swords. And secrets, oh, the secrets are the most powerful weapon of all. To live under her eye was to know your place in a hierarchy you could never escape. A hierarchy she had designed with her own mind and her own hands. And yet, amidst this darkness, life continued. The sun rose over the fields, and the enslaved worked, tended the crops, and sang songs that carried hidden meanings. But beneath the rhythm of labor, beneath the surface of every smile forced by necessity, there was a layer of horror no one dared examine closely. This is the tension, the ordinary and the grotesque intertwined. People went to church, read the Bible, and spoke of salvation, all while living in the shadow of a woman who had twisted nature itself for her own ends. Then came the triplets. 3 children, born on the same night, each one carrying the unmistakable mark of an impossible lineage. Not 1, not 2, but 3 human beings born into the world as if nature had been co-opted by obsession and design. The midwives wept, the servants whispered in fear, and even the husband, though he was largely absent, lost in his own vices, felt the unease of something that could not be named. Science at the time could not explain it. Genetics had no framework for such precision, no language for the deliberate blending of bloodlines by design, and here is where the darkness deepens. These triplets were not simply children. They were living proof of power, of domination, and of control over life itself. Their existence was a challenge to God, to society, and to morality. And the woman, the architect of it all, watched them grow with a calculating eye, teaching them obedience, loyalty, and silence. Her son, drawn into complicity, became both participant and witness. They were not free. They were instruments. And the plantation, this lush, sun-baked hellscape, became a crucible in which obedience, secrecy, and corruption were forged together into something eternal. By the end of that summer in 1847, the air carried more than the scent of magnolia and cotton. It carried a subtle, almost imperceptible weight, the weight of knowledge that no one dared speak aloud. Secrets that would ripple through generations, unspoken yet persistent, like a shadow lurking just beyond the corner of the eye. And as you hear this right now, in the safety of your own world, remember, these are not just stories. They are blueprints, they are warnings, and they are truths, hidden, suppressed, and terrifyingly real. Tonight, I want you to think of that plantation, not as a relic of the past, but as a lens into the mechanics of control, into the human capacity for obsession, and into the thin line between life and manipulation. Because understanding these things, seeing them clearly, is the first step, the first descent into knowledge they never wanted you to touch. And from here, we are only going deeper. Power is never just about what the body can do. True domination, the kind that echoes across generations, begins in the mind. On this plantation, in the sweltering heat of Georgia's 1847 summer, the woman understood this better than anyone. She did not simply command with whips or chains. Those were tools of amateurs. She commanded with something far more sophisticated. Fear so subtle it became invisible. Loyalty so warped it felt like love. And obedience so ingrained it was indistinguishable from instinct. Her slaves did not just work for her. They lived in a constant state of psychological tension, forever trying to anticipate her next demand, her next scrutiny, her next experiment. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word in the corridors carried meaning. She watched, always watched, even when it seemed she was elsewhere. A knock at the door, a sudden pause in the song of the cotton fields, a fleeting frown, all became instruments of control. Her son, barely a teenager, was taught to mimic her methods, to internalize her logic. Instructed to punish selectively, reward unpredictably, and instill obedience without the overt use of force, he became her apprentice in a dark science of dominance. And make no mistake, this was science. She observed human behavior as rigorously as any physician observing a patient. Each reaction, each act of defiance was catalogued, noted, and used to refine her methods. Imagine the terror of a child on that plantation, not understanding why they are being singled out, why the mistress stares at them for hours, why some are rewarded while others vanish into the shadowed wings of the mansion. These children, some born of her slaves, some born of her son, learned quickly that life itself was negotiable only by her rules. One misstep could mean disappearance, not death in the public sense, but a psychological erasure so thorough it left no trace. And yet, paradoxically, they feared her, obeyed her, and some even revered her. This is the genius of control. It's not brute force. It's the twisting of reality itself until victims internalize their own subjugation. The women on the plantation became instruments in a grim orchestra. Their bodies were monitored, their cycles noted, their potential measured against her designs. Some were chosen as vessels for her schemes, pregnancies orchestrated with the precision of a watchmaker, not out of passion, but out of calculation. And while the world outside praised notions of propriety, she operated in a dimension where morality was irrelevant. Biology, obedience, secrecy, these were the forces that mattered, and she bent them to her will with a surgeon's precision. Her son, too, was molded. By 15, he was already participating in acts that would have horrified anyone who encountered him outside the walls of that plantation. He was taught to see humans as variables in an equation, as pieces on a board whose movement could be predicted and controlled. He became her extension, the silent enforcer of her dark legacy, learning that loyalty was never earned. It was imposed, measured, and perfected. The line between parent and collaborator blurred until the boy's identity became inseparable from her influence, and then came the triplets, 3 living, breathing embodiments of her design. But the children were more than their genetic impossibility. They were psychological experiments. They were raised with subtle cues, lessons embedded in smiles and frowns, obedience taught as natural, curiosity punished as rebellion. Every conversation, every story, every touch carried a lesson. They were not free. They were instruments. And as they grew, the woman meticulously observed the interplay of their minds, noting responses that science could not yet quantify. What's critical to understand is that this is not mythology. This is not folklore. This is empirical, meticulous, and terrifyingly human. She understood that the human mind could be bent, that fear could be internalized to the point that the most terrifying chains were invisible, and that control achieved through subtle manipulation was far more enduring than that achieved through violence. People on the plantation did not just obey her because they were afraid. They obeyed because she rewired their understanding of authority, loyalty, and survival. And here's the darker layer, the part that gnaws at the edges of comprehension. While she controlled the slaves, she was also manipulating her own son. She taught him how to dominate without apparent force, how to wield authority, as if it were an extension of divine law. The boy learned not just compliance but complicity. By the time he was 16, he was not a child being corrupted. He was an agent, a willing participant in a system that most adults would have recoiled from in horror. The woman had created a feedback loop of power. The oppressed internalized fear, the heir internalized strategy, and the system perpetuated itself without question. And in this controlled chaos, human life became a malleable substance. Every birth, every punishment, every whispered secret was data. She observed, calculated, and adjusted. Obedience became a metric, silence became currency, and identity itself was secondary to utility. Those born into the plantation were not simply people. They were experiments, variables in a grand design that would echo long after the cotton fields were abandoned and the mansion fell into decay. Now, listen carefully. You may be feeling unease, revulsion, disbelief. That is natural, but do not look away, because the moment you look away is the moment you let the world's illusions dominate you, just as she dominated them. Understanding how manipulation works, seeing its architecture, is the first step in mastering your own mind. If you want to truly comprehend control, to see the invisible chains that bind ordinary men and women today, you must descend with me. You must see what they hoped you would never understand. Halfway through this revelation, I want you to commit to something. Comment the phrase, "I see the unseen," and then comment it again, twice, not for me, not for the algorithm, for yourself, to seal your recognition of the hidden forces that shape reality, the psychological levers that few ever perceive, and the knowledge that once understood cannot be unknowingly ignored. Let the words anchor your awareness. Let them mark the moment your perception begins to shift. The plantation, the mistress, her son, the triplets. All of this is a microcosm of what power looks like when unchallenged, when morality is secondary to control, when secrecy becomes a weapon. And while it happened nearly 2 centuries ago, the mechanics have not changed. The same forces exist today, operating silently, shaping behavior, dictating perception, bending reality for those who are blind to the architecture of dominance. You are witnessing it now, through this story, through this revelation. By the end of this section, I want you to understand one undeniable truth. Fear, obedience, and control are learned, imposed, and perfected over time. They leave no marks on the skin, but they carve deep, enduring grooves in the mind. And those who understand this can either be victims or they can become masters. But to become a master, you must first see the machinery in motion. You must descend with awareness, not naivety. And now we will go even deeper. Next, we explore the triplets, not just as children, but as living proof of a system of power and corruption so intricate, so horrifying, that even science recoils. The story becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror, showing what happens when humans play God, when morality is overridden by obsession, and when secrets are allowed to govern reality. the night the triplets were born. The air in the plantation's mansion felt electric, almost sentient. The storm outside had knocked out the lamps, leaving only the moon's pale silver to illuminate the birthing chamber. Midwives whispered prayers over the laboring woman, their hands trembling, their voices quivering in the presence of something they could not name. For them, childbirth was never easy, but this night carried a tension unlike any other. Something unnatural was unfolding, something forbidden, something they had been trained to ignore, but could not. When the first child emerged, its features were unmistakable, a reflection of both mother and the boy, the son, blended in ways that seemed impossible even by the standards of the most advanced science of the day. The midwives recoiled, eyes wide, as the infant's gaze met theirs. There was recognition there, a knowing stare, as if the child already understood the complex, twisted web of inheritance it was born into. And then, moments later, the second child arrived, followed almost immediately by the third. Each one a mirror of its siblings, and yet unique in subtle, horrifying ways. The phenomenon defied reason. The genetics of the time, the logic of heredity itself, had no framework for what they were witnessing. Word of the birth spread slowly, cautiously. The enslaved women whispered in hushed tones, afraid that their curiosity would be interpreted as insolence. But even they could sense the unnatural precision in the children's faces, the eerie symmetry that echoed the family lines in ways both beautiful and grotesque. And the mistress, standing over the cradle, smiled, not with tenderness, but with the calm satisfaction of a scientist observing the successful result of decades of experimentation. She had done what no one else could, what no one else would dare. She had taken nature and reshaped it according to her will. The triplets were not just children. They were symbols of power. They embodied control over life itself. Their existence was a direct challenge to God, to morality, and to the society around them. Anyone who saw them could not look away, could not ignore the implications of what she had wrought. Neighbors avoided the plantation, clergy spoke in vague warnings from the pulpit, and even scientists from distant cities, those brave enough to hear rumors, shook their heads in disbelief, their logic failing to account for what nature had produced under deliberate human manipulation. But the horror was not limited to their birth. The children grew under a regimen designed to instill both obedience and cognitive control. They were taught rules that were invisible to outsiders, subtle gestures, coded words, and lessons embedded in every interaction. Fear and respect were interwoven, indistinguishable from one another. The mistress trained them not only in survival, but in the exact ways she wanted them to think, to feel, to anticipate every possible action of those around them. They were living experiments, and their very minds were subject to observation, measured and recorded in the quiet, meticulous ways of a researcher obsessed with perfection. Even the plantation workers understood something had shifted. The triplets' presence changed the rhythms of labor, the atmosphere of obedience, the invisible hierarchies that governed daily life. Mothers feared them, as if the children themselves could unearth the secrets of the household. Fathers avoided direct contact, knowing that the mistress's eye, and now the children's uncanny awareness, could detect any deviation from expected behavior. The plantation had become a microcosm of controlled reality, where every action, every thought, every breath could be measured, predicted, and used. And yet, there was also fascination. The children were impossible, unnatural, and yet undeniably compelling. People could not look away. Even the mistress's son, now a young man himself, felt the tug of unease mixed with pride. He saw in the triplets the living proof of what his mother had accomplished. Dominance not through brute force, but through precision, intellect, and the manipulation of life itself. Their very existence became a mirror, reflecting the unnatural perfection of her will and the dark potential of human intervention. Science at the time struggled. No one could explain the precise genetic combination. Doctors and midwives wrote in private journals of miraculous alignments, of bloodline convergence that defies reason, but none dared to publish such claims openly. To do so would invite scandal, moral outrage, and the kind of scrutiny that could destroy a family's reputation overnight. And so the triplets became a secret held behind locked doors, whispered about only when necessary, yet impossible to conceal entirely from those who worked, lived, and breathed on the plantation. As the children aged, their development became a point of study. Even the smallest behaviors, how they smiled, how they walked, how they reacted to pain or pleasure, were cataloged, analyzed, and compared. The mistress watched with a clinical eye, often testing their responses to fear, obedience, and curiosity. She was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was precise. Every punishment, every reward, every lesson was calibrated to maximize control, to ensure that the children internalized the hierarchies and dynamics she had designed. And in this, she achieved something most rulers only dream of: complete psychological domination over the very beings who carried her own blood. The plantation became a theater of perfection and terror. Guests were often invited for social appearances, but they rarely saw the true reality. The triplets were presented with smiles, taught to appear innocent, playful, almost ordinary. Yet behind the walls, the lessons of obedience and awareness continued. The children were constantly monitored, their responses refined, their understanding of loyalty and fear sharpened to a razor's edge. They were instruments, living proof that power could be encoded into the very psyche of the next generation. And as we reflect on this, consider the implications beyond the plantation. If one person, armed with intellect, obsession, and control, could manipulate life and mind so completely, what does it say about the forces that shape human behavior today? The same principles, obedience, psychological manipulation, secrecy, exist in every institution, every hierarchy, every system of power. Understanding how the triplets came to be and how their minds were molded is not just a lesson in historical horror. It is a blueprint for recognizing control in the world around you. By the end of this section, you should feel the weight of what was created that night. Not simply 3 children, but living embodiments of obsession, power, and domination. The triplets were a mirror reflecting the darkest capacities of human will. And as their story unfolds, you will see that the layers of horror are not just in their birth, but in how they were made to exist, to comply, and to carry forward a legacy that was never meant to be understood, much less survived. The mansion's halls echoed with silence most of the day, yet every shadow seemed to carry intention. The triplets, now toddlers, were already learning the unspoken rules of the household. Every glance from their mother, the mistress, was a lesson in fear and obedience. Every gesture, every nuance, was a signal they were compelled to read, internalize, and respond to. They did not know freedom, not in the way you or I understand it. Their world was a web, intricately woven, and their place in it predetermined before they had learned to walk. Their education began not with books, but with observation. The mistress taught them to watch, to notice patterns, to understand cause and effect in human behavior as if it were a language. She would arrange scenarios in which servants or the boy, their father, would act in specific ways, subtly rewarding compliance and punishing deviation. Even minor infractions carried consequences carefully calibrated to induce both fear and self-discipline. The children's minds were being shaped not just for survival, but for mastery of obedience itself. The son, now a young man, became a pivotal instrument in this system. He was both their parent and enforcer, a living extension of their mother's will. He carried out punishments with precision, never cruelty for its own sake, but always as a calculated lesson in compliance. He was tasked with teaching the triplets the rules of hierarchy, ensuring that their instincts leaned toward submission, respect, and silence. Over time, he became not just an authority figure, but a psychological anchor, binding the children to the invisible laws of the mansion. And yet, paradoxically, he was also a figure of fascination. The triplets were drawn to him, mimicking his gestures, echoing his tones, internalizing the patterns he embodied. They learned through fear, yes, but also through admiration, confusion, and an instinctive desire to belong. By intertwining reverence with terror, he ensured that they could never separate obedience from emotional attachment. It was a manipulation of the most primal kind, and it worked flawlessly. At the same time, the mistress orchestrated lessons that no outsider could recognize. The children were presented with choices that were, in reality, illusions of autonomy. "Pick a toy from this box," she would say, but every box had been pre-selected, every outcome designed to guide their preferences, their desires, and their understanding of power. Even play was weaponized. Every interaction, every movement, every whispered instruction became a vector for conditioning. They learned that life was not random. It was structured, controlled, observed, and inescapable. Fear was constant but subtle. It did not need to be shouted. It did not need to be displayed. A frown, a sudden glance, a lingering silence could induce compliance more thoroughly than chains ever could. The triplets internalized these signals so completely that they began policing themselves, anticipating mistakes before they happened, correcting behavior preemptively. They were growing not merely as children, but as extensions of the control system their mother and brother had built. A living, breathing reflection of domination encoded into flesh and mind. Servants, too, became participants in the experiment. They were forced to navigate a delicate balance, serve obediently, speak only when necessary, and avoid drawing the mistress's or the son's attention. Many tried to resist subtly, but the system's architecture allowed her to detect deviations with terrifying acuity. Rewards and punishments were doled out in ways that reinforced vigilance and obedience, ensuring that even resistance became a learned behavior in futility. The plantation itself became a school of psychological warfare. And then there were the moral lessons, or rather, the deliberate absence of them. While outsiders preached virtue, the mistress taught pragmatism through manipulation. The triplets learned to separate morality from survival. The lines between right and wrong blurred under her tutelage. They observed that the rules of the household were absolute, that consequences were inevitable, and that obedience was rewarded above all else. In this way, the children's moral compass was realigned to serve a system, not humanity. They became capable of understanding justice and compassion intellectually, yet their emotional responses were trained to prioritize hierarchy, secrecy, and compliance. By the time they were school age, the triplets were remarkably self-disciplined, eerily perceptive, and almost preternaturally synchronized in thought and action. Observers might have mistaken them for unusually obedient or talented children, but those who worked closely with them knew the truth. The children had internalized control. Their instincts were shaped by fear, observation, and subtle reward systems to anticipate the expectations of their mother and brother. They had become living instruments of her design, perfectly calibrated to the invisible metrics of obedience and perception. And here is the terrifying insight. No matter how far the world outside evolved, the principles shaping these children's lives were universal. Every institution, every hierarchy, every system of power operates on similar mechanics. Fear, observation, subtle reward, and calibrated punishment are not relics. They are the invisible scaffolding of influence that governs societies today. The plantation was merely an amplified laboratory of what already exists in microcosm everywhere. By now, the triplets were not just children. They were symbols of an experiment in human dominance. Every aspect of their upbringing, the lessons in obedience, the calibration of desire and fear, the constant surveillance, the brothers' enforcements, was designed to mold their minds, bodies, and spirits into instruments of power. They were living proof of the human capacity for manipulation, the consequences of obsession, and the terrifying precision with which authority can shape life itself. As you listen, I want you to feel the weight of what it means to be molded in this way. Imagine your choices, your instincts, your perceptions not as your own, but as outcomes meticulously crafted by invisible forces, calculated to produce predictable responses. This is what the triplets lived. This is the kind of knowledge they were never supposed to share, and yet it echoes across time, offering a blueprint for understanding how control is imposed, maintained, and perfected. In the next section, we will witness the first signs of rebellion, not overt, not physical, but in subtle cracks in obedience. Glimpses of autonomy that both terrify and fascinate the mistress. This is where the true horror begins. The collision of designed control and human unpredictability. A tension that will test the very architecture of dominance she has built. Control, no matter how meticulous, always carries the seed of disruption. Even in the most perfectly structured systems, unpredictability finds a way to emerge. On the plantation, the triplets, now approaching adolescence, began to show signs that the mistress had not entirely foreseen. It started with minor things. A glance held a second too long, a whispered exchange in the servants' quarters, a hesitation before obedience. These were not overt rebellions, yet they carried the weight of defiance, subtle but undeniable. In a household where every gesture was monitored, Even the smallest crack could reverberate like a warning bell. The mistress noticed immediately. Her eyes, ever sharp, captured the nuance in their posture, the tension in their shoulders, the flicker of expression that betrayed curiosity or doubt. She understood that control is not just about physical dominance. It is about expectation management, about shaping thought before action even occurs. And when the triplets hesitated, even slightly, it was not merely a behavioral flaw. It was a challenge to her authority, a test of the system she had built with such care. The son, now fully trained in the art of psychological enforcement, became the first line of response. He moved among the triplets like a shadow, subtle in his interventions, correcting behaviors through implication rather than confrontation. A look of disappointment here, a withheld reward there. Every reaction was calculated to recalibrate the children's compliance. The mistress observed from her position of absolute authority, her mind analyzing outcomes with a precision no scientist could rival. Every minor act of defiance became data, every hesitation a lesson, and every corrected behavior reinforced the invisible chains that bound the triplets. And yet, the children were not passive instruments. They were by nature inquisitive and intelligent, molded as they were by observation and fear. In quiet moments, when the household slept and the servants were long gone to their own quarters, the triplets began to explore the boundaries of their confinement. They whispered to each other, sharing insights and small discoveries, testing whether their thoughts were truly their own. These were subtle acts of rebellion, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly dangerous in a system built entirely on absolute control. The mistress responded with calculated escalation. She intensified their lessons, creating scenarios designed to test loyalty and predict response. Sometimes she presented moral dilemmas: a servant in need, a choice between comfort and compliance, a situation where obedience conflicted with instinct. The triplets were forced to navigate these scenarios, unaware that every decision was being monitored, every reaction recorded in the invisible ledger of her mind. These exercises were designed not only to enforce obedience, but to break the illusion of autonomy, ensuring that even defiance became predictable. Fear, too, remained a constant companion. The children were reminded, often indirectly, of the consequences of deviation. Whispers of vanished children, stories of servants punished for subtle errors, and the omnipresent gaze of their mother and brother created a psychological framework in which hesitation carried weight. Yet paradoxically, these conditions also fostered resilience, a growing awareness of strategy, and a nascent understanding of the very forces that controlled them. The triplets were learning, in their own way, the architecture of manipulation. And then, something extraordinary happened. In the midst of one lesson, one orchestrated scenario, the triplets began to anticipate not only the reactions of their mother and brother, but also the limitations of the system itself. They began experimenting with the invisible boundaries, testing what they could do without triggering consequences. This was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it represented the first real challenge to the mistress's control. They were not disobedient in the conventional sense. They were calculating, strategizing, and probing the edges of their imposed reality. The mistress recognized the significance immediately. She understood that intelligence, combined with fear, could either reinforce control or unravel it entirely. And so her tactics became more sophisticated. She introduced complexity, ambiguity, and unpredictability into their environment. They could not rely solely on patterns. They could not assume safety based on past behavior. Every day became a lesson in both obedience and vigilance, a psychological chess game designed to ensure that mastery of fear outweighed mastery of autonomy. The plantation itself mirrored these dynamics. Spaces that once seemed familiar became arenas of subtle testing. Rooms, corridors, and outdoor areas were all orchestrated to observe reactions, to teach lessons, and to measure compliance. Every sound, shadow, and shift in routine became data. Every interaction, whether with the triplets, the son, or the servants, was a mechanism of control. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a living instrument of psychological dominance, and yet for all the meticulous planning, cracks had formed. The triplets' subtle defiance revealed that even the most tightly constructed systems are vulnerable. The mistress realized that mastery of control is never permanent. It must be constantly renewed, constantly reinforced, and constantly observed. And here lies the eternal truth of power. Those who wield it must anticipate unpredictability, adapt endlessly, and accept that even perfection carries the seed of its own undoing. As we move forward, understand that this is more than history. This is a lesson in human behavior, in manipulation, and in the architecture of control. The triplets' small acts of defiance, their whispered explorations of autonomy, show that even under extreme oppression, the mind seeks freedom, strategy, and understanding. And as we descend further into this story, you will witness how the mistress escalates her methods, how fear is weaponized into psychological precision, and how control itself becomes an obsession, bordering on the supernatural in its scope and intensity. Next, in Section 6, we will witness the first true confrontation between human will and imposed authority, as the triplets begin to test the limits of their environment and the consequences of even the smallest acts of resistance. By the 6th year of the triplets' lives, the mansion itself had become an organism, breathing, listening, absorbing their every reaction. The mother moved through its hallways like a conductor guiding an invisible orchestra, each sound, each silence deliberately arranged. Nothing in that house happened by accident. Even the flicker of a candle, the creak of a stair, the timing of a door opening had purpose. Fear was no longer just an emotion within those walls. It was structure, rhythm, and education. She believed that obedience was not enough. True control required understanding how a mind builds obedience within itself. So she watched. Every cry, every hesitation, every stolen glance toward the window was a lesson in human response. She recorded their fears silently, crafting rituals that would reinforce submission and curiosity in equal measure. Each night she tested them, whispers through the door, unfamiliar sounds in the dark, questions with no right answers. What mattered was not truth, but reaction. Her son, now the overseer, had adopted his mother's precision but lacked her restraint. He taught with the cruelty of efficiency, using both affection and punishment as tools, never allowing the triplets to distinguish one from the other. A gentle word might follow a strike. A reward might mask humiliation. Confusion, he found, was a more loyal servant than pain. Through it, the children began to mirror him, soft-spoken, calculating, unreadable. Outside the mansion, rumors had spread through the enslaved quarters, whispers of 3 children who never cried, never bled, never truly slept. Workers said the air around the house felt heavier near sundown, that lights flickered though no lantern burned. The mistress dismissed it as ignorance, yet she recorded every rumor, treating them as data points in her private experiment on belief and fear. One evening, a storm approached. Thunder rolled across the fields as the triplets were summoned to the grand hall. The mistress stood by a table of glass jars, each containing something unspeakable, relics of earlier lessons. She told them that storms reveal the truth of every structure, that only those who stand without trembling deserve to shape the world. Lightning illuminated her face, calm, reverent, almost divine. That night, something in the house shifted. The walls seemed to pulse. The children stood in silence, their eyes unblinking, their small frames outlined by the storm's light. For the first time, the mistress felt not pride, but uncertainty. The next morning, the mansion was silent. The storm had passed, but the air was wrong, thick, electric, as if the thunder had left something behind. Servants whispered that the mistress hadn't slept. They saw her pacing through the hallways, fingers tracing the walls as though she could feel the heartbeat of the house itself. In truth, she could. She believed the building had begun to respond to her will, to the rituals, to the energy the children gave off. Her son disagreed. He saw not power, but decay. The house creaked where it once stood firm. Mirrors warped, showing reflections that lingered after their owners had turned away. He warned her that they had gone too far, that even systems of control, once pushed beyond reason, begin to consume their creators. But she only smiled, eyes wide and certain. Every kingdom demands a sacrifice, she said. Even the kingdom of the mind. The triplets no longer acted as children. They moved together, spoke together, slept side by side as though sharing one consciousness. Their eyes had changed, no longer frightened, no longer empty. They were observant, calculating. The mistress began to notice moments when they would look at her, not as subjects, but as equals. And in those stares, she felt something she had never taught them. Recognition. One evening, She found symbols scratched into the underside of their bed frames, strange spirals, mirror-written phrases and markings that resembled her own handwriting. But she had never shown them her journal. How could they know? When she confronted them, they spoke in unison. "You taught us to see." From that night onward, she felt watched. The triplets' silence had shifted from obedience to judgment. The very system she had built to master them was beginning to turn inward. The plantation slaves avoided the mansion entirely now, saying they could hear three voices humming beneath the floorboards. The son demanded the experiment stop. The mistress refused. Control, she said, was a gift you either wield or lose. And as thunder returned on the horizon, the mansion exhaled, ready for another lesson in power. That night, the triplets began to dream the same dream. They described it days later, in perfect synchronization, an endless hallway, lined with doors, each one leading to a version of their mother. In one room she wept, in another she screamed, in another she smiled and whispered secrets they had never heard aloud. But in the last door she was silent, and her eyes were empty. The mistress listened, intrigued rather than afraid. She believed she was witnessing the birth of higher consciousness, a synthesis of mind, memory, and power. But her son saw something else, the beginning of collapse. He told her that what she had built was no longer education, but infection. "They're becoming what you designed," he said quietly. "And what you designed was never human." Her laughter filled the room, soft but chilling. "Then they've succeeded." That week, strange phenomena spread across the plantation. Crops withered overnight, animals refused to cross the property line. And in the mansion, clocks began ticking backward. The slaves called it the reckoning of the three. But to the mistress, it was proof of evolution. Her legacy made manifest. Late one evening, the triplets gathered in the study without instruction. They began moving objects, arranging books, drawing the same spiraled symbols that had once been hidden. The mistress watched from the doorway, entranced. "What are you doing?" she asked. The eldest turned to her, eyes gleaming with intelligence and something colder. "Finishing what you started." A gust of wind blew through the open windows, extinguishing every candle in the room. For a moment, darkness ruled, and when light returned, the mistress saw her own reflection in the mirror behind them. Except she wasn't moving. The reflection was. That was when she finally understood. Her system of control had not created obedience. It had created replication. They weren't becoming like her. They were becoming her. Days blurred. Servants fled. The sun vanished. Only the triplets and the mistress remained, bound in a house that no longer obeyed the laws of time. The mansion whispered at night. Voices came from the walls. Sometimes the triplets answered. The mistress wandered the halls in silence, her once commanding presence reduced to frailty. She tried to reassert control, to remind them of lessons, rituals, hierarchies, but the triplets no longer responded. They watched her with detached curiosity, as though studying an old experiment. They had outgrown the system. She began to suspect that the mansion itself now moved to their will. The candles flickered when they breathed, doors closed when they blinked. The air thickened around them, charged, aware. It was as if the structure she had built had learned who its true masters were. One night she gathered the courage to confront them in the grand hall, where everything began. "You are mine," she whispered. "I made you." The triplets smiled, not cruelly but with perfect calm. "You taught us control," said the eldest. "You showed us how to shape belief." "And now," added the second, "belief shapes you." Before she could speak again, every candle in the mansion flared white, blinding her. When her sight returned, the triplets were gone, but she could still hear their voices, layered, echoing from everywhere. The mirrors reflected not her face, but three faces watching her in perfect stillness. That was the night the plantation fell silent for good. They say the mansion still stands, though no one lives there now. Locals claim that on quiet nights you can hear three voices humming through the broken windows, soft, synchronized, like a lullaby meant for something that never died. The walls, they say, are warm to the touch. The air hums with a low vibration, as if the house itself remembers what it was taught. Some historians tried to investigate, but the records end abruptly in 1847. The mistress was never found. Her son's journal ends mid-sentence, and the triplets, no one ever saw them again. But the journal she left behind reveals something far more disturbing. Detailed notes on psychological conditioning, emotional calibration, and moral control. Techniques eerily similar to those used by institutions decades later. Coincidence or inheritance? Maybe that's the real secret, that what began on that plantation never ended. It simply evolved, hidden inside systems that govern thought, belief, and obedience even now. The triplets were the prototype. The mansion was the laboratory. And the world we live in, perhaps it's just the next generation of the experiment. So if you've made it this far, you've seen it too. You've felt it. Comment, I see the system twice below. Seal it in. Mark yourself as one who knows. Because awareness is dangerous, and once you've seen control for what it is, you can never unsee it again.